more than many other countries, India is a great melting pot. We are the place where many, many people, ideas, religions, cultures, species came together. Um, as you are only half Bengali, I shall risk uh, uh, extreme responses when I say to you that there are some people who believe that the geographical indicator for the Rasgulla should be in Orissa and not in Bengal, and that this idea was brought there by the Portuguese. So the Rasgulla is not quintessentially Bengali, according to some, and it is a subject of much debate.
Sugar is poison, colonialism is bad, now we know why. Carry on. Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay. Ajay, man, what's happening?
Everything is good. Tell me about this Indian look.
Okay, so first of all, I will argue and say it's not an Indian look. I was wearing t-shirt and jeans in the last episode. I've been wearing shirt pants. To me, they are all quintessentially Indian. And even this particular dress, is it really Indian? I mean, one argument is everything is Indian. Another argument is actually nothing is quintessentially Indian in the sense stitched clothing came from outside. I'm wearing a Patiala salwar, which, like the elegant churidars of a fine prime minister who looks just like you, Middle Eastern origin and so on and so forth. And I would actually say the same thing about language. In the sense that I often tell people and I argue that, hey, I speak in English and that's okay, but that doesn't mean I'm some deracinated westernized person. I say English is an Indian language, and not only is English an Indian language, you could simultaneously make the opposite argument and say English is not even an English language because it's a delightful Khichdi. You look at the influences that come into English, it borrows from Roman, it borrows from Greek, from Persian, from Anglo-Saxon, from Hindustani. The word juggernaut comes from Jagannath, and indeed the show, one could argue, is like a juggernaut, blazing its way through the forests of YouTube. But leaving that aside, it's good to be back.
I mean, surely you're pushing that too far. There are things that are quintessentially about a place. Surely chicken tandoori belongs in Ludhiana.
We will talk about chicken tandoori. It absolutely doesn't belong to Ludhiana. Hello there, and we will talk about that. But first, I want to refer to this interesting piece of news I saw the other day, which was about salmon sushi. Where is salmon sushi from?
There's plenty of salmon in the Pacific, so Japan.
Right. So salmon sushi we think of as something quintessentially Japanese. If you're having sushi, that's like the default thing that I'll tend to order. I love it. Right. But the truth is that salmon sushi as a concept did not exist till the 1980s. So what happened in the 1980s was that Norway, who, used to, what's the word for, you don't grow salmon, harvest a lot of salmon. They used to harvest a lot of salmon, had an excess of it, right? And they couldn't find a way to store it. There was way too much. They wanted to look at export markets. So they sent a gentleman named Bjorn Erik Olsen. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Apologies to my Norwegian viewers if I'm not. I do my best. I pronounce even Indian and English words wrong, which are actually the same as we discussed. So Bjorn Erik Olsen goes to Japan and he meets all the fishery companies, right? And he tries to tell them that, hey, why don't you buy salmon from us and all of that. And there are a bunch of problems. First, that is not exactly what the Japanese are used to. One of the objections was, hey, it's not red enough. It's like too pink or whatever. It's not red enough for us. Another objection was that in Japan, the local salmon that had been fished was associated with parasites. So, what was Norway to do? Apparently, they ran some kind of advertising campaign to convince people our waters are completely pure. It just wasn't working. The salmon situation was going out of hand. Now, no doubt I exaggerate, but as a storyteller, I must imagine what was happening in salmon, that there was no place to store it in the traditional warehouses. So it spilled out in the streets. It was stored in schools. Kids couldn't go to school because the classrooms were full of salmon. That's the kind of thing I imagine. Law and order went amok because the police stations were full of salmon. Where do you go to find a policeman? You could say it's like a salmon maximizer, like, the paperclip maximizer, the famous thought experiment. So anyway, Bjorn Erik Olsen tries one final desperate tactic. He goes to this Japanese food company called Nishire. Again, apologies if I'm not pronouncing it right. Goes to this company called Nishire and offers to sell them something like 5,000 or 50,000 tons of salmon, I forget what, at a really cheap price, and says you offer it as sushi. You sell it as sushi to the market. And Nishire says, okay, we are getting really cheap fish. Why not do that? Who can say no to cheap fish? And they do exactly that. And it suddenly takes off. And not only does it take off, it has an interesting effect where it not only helps Norway deal with their excess salmon and the kids can start going to school again, but it helps Japan as well. Because this is that inflection point where sushi takes off as a global dish. Because salmon sushi is the most palatable to Western appetites. At least that's how the theory goes. You know, it's mild in taste and everything is the most palatable. And with salmon sushi, it's not just that Norwegian salmon was saved, but Japanese sushi was popularized. And this is such an incredible story that when I first heard it, I was like, what? Because we associate salmon sushi with Japan. But it's not the case. And then when I start, digging a little deeper, I find that there are so many things which are, like ramen, for example, is also relatively recent. I forget the exact timelines, but it is not as if it goes back centuries and is a staple food and all that. And of course, pretty much all Indian food, but we'll come to that later. So I want to point out that it's not just the rest of the world, but even in India, we think of various things as, ye to Indian food hai, but almost everything we think of as Indian food is from somewhere else, whether it's rajma chawal or tandoori chicken or whatever. I have done various episodes of The Seen and the Unseen that talk about different aspects of this. I'll link them from the show notes. Did a great episode called The Indianness of Indian Food with Vikram Doctor, who in my opinion is the world's best food writer. That'll be linked from the show notes. Plus with Pushpesh Pant ji, who's had decades of experience, eloquent writer about this. Recently with Krish Ashok and Naren Shenoy, and with Ashok I've recorded once before as well. And while researching for these episodes, you realize that there is nothing in our food that actually originated here, right? For example, there was something called the Columbian Exchange, and a lot of things like potato, mirchi, tomato, amrood, etc., all came from South America. Pushpesh Panji has this great book called India, the cooking book or something like that. We'll link it from the show notes and show you the cover here. And in that, he writes about Vasco da Gama, quote, "It is estimated that one of his shipments alone consisted of 1,500 tons of pepper, 28 tons of ginger, 8 tons of cinnamon, and 7 tons of cloves. And while India's spices attracted Europeans to the area, the traders brought with them the culinary secrets of leavened bread, baking, and noodles. In return, the Indians introduced the Europeans to the joys of curry, mangoes, and chutney." Now, in his episode with me, Vikram, or Doc as we call him, pointed out that even things like ganda fool, marigold, so common in marriages, that comes from Mexico. Or Mexico, as it were, whatever you call it. And, lest you think, why are we talking about flowers? In Monsoon Wedding, I think one of the characters is shown constantly eating it, right? Saffron, you might think is quintessentially Indian, especially in a symbolic kind of way. But while the color is very much associated with India since way back when, the actual ingredient, saffron, also comes from outside. It's grown in colder northern climates, probably reached us via the Middle East. And in India, Kashmir is really the only place that has the right temperature to grow saffron. And I know you love saffron with a little bit of cream. We will talk about that later. I want to know all about how you got that habit and so on and so forth. And even idli, like Doc was telling me that there is sort of a speculation that fermentation originated in Indonesia, and possibly when that Tamil exchange was happening with Indonesia, that's when idlis came over. So even idlis, in that sense, aren't Indian to begin with. And the list goes on and on. One of my friends who used to edit my pieces when I used to write a column for the Hindu Business Line, Swati Banerjee, she wrote a piece, and I think later did a video, we'll link them from the show notes, where she tried to recreate the Indus Valley meal, what it would have been like. And the only ingredient we can recognize in what she made, if I remember correctly, is bangan. And the other day we were talking about how can you judge somebody's distance from a Maharashtrian village, and if they refer to that particular thing as wangi, then they're really close. Bangan, one step removed, and then eggplant, another step removed, and then aubergine and brinjal, or rather brinjal is in the middle actually. Eggplant is right at the end because I think that's what America calls it. So, and I don't think this is an issue. I think this is absolutely freaking delightful. Like to me, you could say that all of these came from outside. I'm like, hey, even I mean, if you go back long enough, even we came
We
from
came from
Africa.
outside. Yeah.
Even we came from Africa. So I'm, completely sort of delighted about this, because I think the best things like language, like food, like clothes are always a khichdi. Though I would not wear literally a khichdi, but a bit messy perhaps. But the best things are always a khichdi, a delightful mixture, and that is a joy. And therefore, you can make the narrow argument that nothing is really Indian, so we shouldn't call anything Indian per se. But my broader argument would be that everything is Indian. Sab lao, we will embrace everything.
Yeah. More than many other countries, India is a great melting pot. We are the place where many people, ideas, religions, cultures, species came together. Um, as you are only half Bengali, I shall risk uh, uh, extreme responses when I say to you that there are some people who believe that the geographical indicator for the Rasgulla should be in Orissa and not in Bengal, and that this idea was brought there by the Portuguese. So the Rasgulla is not quintessentially Bengali, according to some, and it is a subject of much debate.
Sugar is poison, colonialism is bad, now we know why. Carry on.
Yeah. My favorite story about the Colombian exchange is about the potato. Okay? And the story runs like this. Uh, James C. Scott has emphasized how important grain was in the emergence of early states. Grain is dense in calories, and grain is storable, and it can be expropriated, and it can be transported. Okay, so if you had a pre-grain culture where you're eating bananas and papayas, there's nothing that keeps. You have last week's supply of papaya and banana. And if an invading army comes, they can take away 1 week's worth of banana and papaya. And per gram, there's not a whole lot of storable calories. Whereas grain is different. Grain is a new milestone in human history, that it can be grabbed, it can be stored, and it is dense in calories. So grain is very dangerous. In the great wars of Europe, marauding armies would go through the landscape, finding people, finding villages, and grabbing grain. In this process, the young Frederick the Great found that villagers did better when they had potatoes. Okay, so what was the logic? The potato plant looks like a humble plant. For a mind that is trained to look for the ear of corn or wheat growing at the top of the plant, the potato is growing below the soil, so you don't really see that much. And even once harvested, it looks dirty, it looks filthy, it doesn't look really exciting. So the invading armies were not conscious about trying to grab potatoes, and further, the local people would not harvest the potato from the ground and keep it in inventory. They would rather keep picking it up from the plant as and when required. So Frederick the Great observed that when the wars took place and great armies went up and down and destroyed the lives of local people, the presence of potatoes was a very useful thing, and it kept people alive. It helped the peasants to survive. And so then when he became the king, he did a lot of agricultural extension surrounding potatoes, and in some cases with remarkable implications for the military outcomes around the wars that he fought late in his life. So this is such a interesting story, that a potato starts out in South America and reshapes the logistics of European armies under the influence of agricultural extension led by Frederick the Great. There is one funny story when Frederick the Great published a king's order on potatoes, where people were told that you must grow potatoes, and the people were very dismissive. This is a ugly thing. What do you want to do? It's a nightshade vegetable. There are some toxins. If you don't handle it correctly, you get into trouble. So there were enough concerns. It was not as well understood as we understand it today. So people were skeptical and nobody wanted to do it. So there is an apocryphal story or a true story where Frederick the Great ordered that potatoes should be grown in the royal gardens, and he greatly amped up the protection of those gardens so that poor people would think that, ooh, something precious is going on. And he instructed the soldiers to turn a blind eye when people came and stole the potatoes. So this is the best way to make something work. It is to announce that it is illegal. So now you know why cryptocurrency has such a great future in India.
A brilliant play of incentives. I have two things to say, and each of them involves a great hero of ours. First great hero, you mentioned James C. Scott. So I'm just going to tell all our viewers, or you would call them gentle readers, but I'm going to tell them all, do pick up his book, Against the Grain, magnificent book, just a masterpiece. Everyone should read it, and every other book of his. And the second is about another of our great heroes, Bare Ghulam Ali Khan, right? So Bare Ghulam Ali Khan, back in the day, was invited to perform at a particular place where he was, going to be kept up for 2 or 3 days, and at the end of the 2 or 3 days, he would perform, and that's how the gig was going to be. But they were vegetarian, and they insisted on serving vegetarian food. So he lands up there and he gets vegetarian food the first day and vegetarian food the second day, and so on and so forth. And then when he sings on the third day, he is but a shadow of his self. It is a meager performance, and everybody's kind of disappointed that such a great genius, and so on and so forth. And afterwards, the Raja, or whoever the main host was, goes to him and says ki Ustad Sahab, we have heard that jab aap riyaz karte hai, when you do your riyaz, you do it besides the ocean, and the sounds of your raga drowns out the roar of the waves. So how come you performed like this today? And Bare Ghulam Ali Khan said, "E khana to e gana." Right? And I know that Julius Caesar I find that really endearing, and I completely share his desire for meat, as it were. But Julius Caesar would have objected, and I want you to tell us why.
There's beautiful words put into his mouth by George Bernard Shaw. He is a barbarian who thinks that the customs of his tribe and island are the law of nature.
It's such a beautiful quote, and it also is a cautionary tale to all of us that, let us not take too much pride in a particular thing that, oh, this is Indian, this is Sanskari or whatever, because, a lot of what we think are quintessential to us, or, are who we are actually come from outside, which is a great thing. They are a Khichdi. The world is changing. The world will continue to change. But there is a danger also, and that's what I want to talk about next.
So tell me, Amit, does the world just keep playing a game of recombinant DNA and we keep inventing newer and newer combinations? Or does it become something less exciting?
I wish. The problem is things can also go in the other direction. And a great example of this was given to me by Vikram Doctor himself in that episode where he spoke about the Cavendish banana. And this to me has become like a metaphor for the dangers of homogenization. India gave bananas to the world. More or less, we used to export bananas. We have an incredible diversity of bananas, right? We are in the best way possible. We are a banana republic. So we give bananas to the world, which went, by the way, in the worst way possible to the banana republics of Latin America. Now, what happened there was that bananas kind of got homogenized, and a strain of banana that became really popular was the Cavendish banana, right? The Cavendish banana is a tall yellow banana or golden banana, which tastes like shit, right? It is just boring, monotonous, dull. Every other banana we have, and there are hundreds of them, are better bananas than that banana. Now, after we gave bananas to the world, those buggers turned it into that ridiculous homogenized thing, and they sent it back to India. Right now, it has certain advantages. Economies of scale, it might work. It can, it can last for many days. All of those random things are there. But the result is, and this is a great lament of Doc, that our indigenous bananas are dying out because bhaiya Cavendish aa gaye bahar se, and our indigenous bananas are dying out, and that food diversity is under threat. And I know you'll agree that it's an absolutely sort of terrible thing. And there are other examples of this. For example, Pushpesh Pantji in his conversation with me, ranted about how you go to any wedding in any part of the country, you'll have one stall which will give you Punjabi food, and then there'll be a chow mein stall, and that's it. And you look at the incredible food diversity of our country, where you'll find, like, I had done a food trip with a bunch of friends of mine, many of whom, we took a bus, we went to Mysore and Bangalore. And often you'll find that within 2 square kilometers of a particular place, you have 6 different kinds of biryani which have emerged from 6 different cuisines and have all originated there, and they're all different from each other, and it is absolutely delightful, right? So to find the kind of homogenization that then happens is incredibly sad. And there are also sort of what I call the Pushpesh Panth pet peeves, and I want to read them out. So it's 4 P's. You'll notice the alliteration: Pushpesh Panth pet peeves. And if you wore Patiala pants like me, 2 more P's. But these are the pet peeves, and I love them. One, there is a tyranny of the tandoor. Two, there is a curse of the curry. And he's got a great sentence where he talks about this, where he says, that generic word for any gravy based Indian dish introduced by the British, who couldn't discriminate between a korma and a salan, and now repeated idiotically by ourselves. Right? So there's a tyranny of the tandoor, the curse of the curry, and the myth of Mughlai. And all of them beautifully alliterative: Pushpesh Panth pet peeves and Patiala pants. And and that used to be a danger that I worry about, except that I worry no more, because what I have found is that in that initial burst of markets coming to a particular place, you have that drive towards scale and you have the homogenizing influence. But now that markets are deeper and our technology allows a kind of decentralization that we see around us, I find that actually technology and markets are what will help these different kinds of foods survive. I've often spoken about this in the context, obviously, of Stage.in, which does a Netflix for Bharat, and they have content in Haryanvi, Bhojpuri, and a couple of other dialects. And what they do there is that dialects are dying down, homogenization towards languages, but they have sort of reversed that. And there is a long tail. You don't need economies of scale to succeed, and therefore there is hope there that all of these cuisines can indeed survive. And there's a beautiful line by Pushpesh I want to read out. The well-traveled and well-heeled Indian today is far more discriminating when the cuisine in question is European, Chinese, Japanese, Arab, or Mediterranean. The dazzling diversity of Indian inheritance remains to be discovered. And elsewhere, he speaks about how when we think of countries, we often think of lines on a map. And I have long argued about, why we shouldn't normalize a nation state or necessarily take it for granted and think it is the only kind of organization there is. And Pushpesh beautifully writes, even the post-independence reorganization of Indian states themselves on linguistic lines by Jawaharlal Nehru has confused us completely. And when we think of maps for different kinds of food now, we trace out of the lines of the states we learnt in school. I want to make a different kind of food map of India, one in which zones are demarcated based on what they traditionally use as a souring agent: tamarind or kokum, dried mango or vinegar, starfruit or lime, or what is the base spice for their gravies. Stop quote. And just sort of beautiful language by Pushpesh ji. His episode with me was remarkable, and a sentiment I agree with completely, that our country is so diverse and all of us should really, just dive into its riches. We don't need to go on a vacation elsewhere and say Italian cuisine khaya, pasta khaya, Chinese khaya. No, I mean, there's so much variety just around us.
Yeah. So, some things that have bothered me is the tyranny of basmati rice. There are thousands of rice cultivars in India, and we've just got this overwhelming upper class focus that by default a nice fluffy basmati rice, and I actually have turned this upside down. I will never eat basmati rice. I will take interest in every other rice in the world, but this is one.
See, we have to alliterate learning from Pushpesh ji, so I would call it the barbarism of basmati rice. Does that work for you?
Yeah, brutality of basmati.
Brutality as well, yeah.
Yeah. The second thing that we should think about is the interconnection between the cultural aspect of food. What you've described is food culture, is a philosophy of food, and I'm there 100%. But, different people could choose to disagree. But I also want to put up something more objective, which is the health crisis associated with industrial food. So the homogenizing influence is often driven by big food, by industrial food, by large companies who want standardization of the customer experience all over the country. And then they freeze on certain fixed things. So the glory of the McDonald's French fries is one particular Idaho russet potato. Everywhere in the world, wherever you get that amazing McDonald's French fry, it is one cultivar of potato. So the homogenization runs with industrial food. But it is really an important act of self-preservation for all of us to question industrialization of food, to question the processed food, which has all kinds of harms. It is impossible to think deeply about the health system without thinking deeply about the food system. And happily, these pieces are all internally consistent, that we would plead for more artisanal food, more local food, and that will take us back to what is feasible culturally, technologically within your backyard. And that will be a better world for all of us. And then as we move across India, in every 50 kilometers, every 100 kilometers, we'll get a brand new cuisine, which will just be, so great and so interesting. Here I want to link to the experiences of architecture, language, and the underlying technological foundation. So let's think about architecture. Architecture varies all over the world. You can engage in aping somebody else. So when you transplant a certain look, when a look gets a certain kind of prestige, then powerful people who want to impress the natives build imposing structures. I have an article on where great feats of architecture come from. And really, it's a mind job where powerful people want to make the peasants bow to their authority. The more totalitarian the regime, the greater their interest in imposing structures. And the technology plays a reduced role when you are just in this game of impressing somebody. If you actually think from first principles, architecture is about local conditions, local weather, local materials, local craftsmanship, and every region develops its own genre of something that fits, that's appropriate, which uses local materials, that is well placed vis-a-vis the weather, and that really is the right thing to do for that region. And of course, there is endless human creativity. So I don't want to be a Luddite. New technology will come. So it's not like architecture is frozen like a fly in amber. Architecture also reflects the thinking, the problem solving, reflecting local conditions and the emergence of technology. I think similarly about food, that food culture should not be a fly in amber. It should evolve and it should reflect local conditions, local preferences, local problems. And that way, there's a thinking process where we are questioning and we are being creative and we are evolving, but we are not, aping. So it would be nice to think of food culture in a little more first principles way of what is the wise and sensible thing to do in terms of convenience, local production, the health considerations, and so on. So there's this analogy between architecture and food in terms of the extent of localness. But then let's turn to language. Okay, there was a great flattening sound all over the world when mass media came up. So when radio and television and movies came up, the beautiful heterogeneity of language did shrink at first. Okay, so English was a highly heterogeneous language. And for example, in America, there were many, many different communities which had come over from Europe who were all different in their own way. But with the rise of television and movies, it became the case that there was one single median accent and language, which is modern standard American English. And that became the standard language of America, though some people in the South will continue to protest that we don't speak American. Okay, in similar fashion, it would be a stretch to call a single homogeneous language of North India as Hindustani, because actually there were many, many dialects and strains, and in the sense of what you described as a nation state, a language is a dialect with a navy. So in that sense, there are just so many languages, there's so much heterogeneity, there's so much difference. And when modern technology came and we got the scale, and also when the Indian state took Hindi promotion upon itself, then you started getting a great flattening sound, where suddenly the beautiful heterogeneity of the languages of North India was sought to be replaced by one single standard, and that's Hindi. And a scant 75 years ago, there was no Hindi, there was Hindustani, and Hindustani was diverse and it was a people's language. It was not administrative, top-down, government-imposed language. It had its own dynamic. So we've got to think about these kinds of impulses. But think about food and think about language. Exactly as you said about Netflix. Stage one of electronics is the homogenization of radio and TV, which is mass media. But now we've reached that new world of the internet where people can go to YouTube and discover Konkani shows. And in fact, as has been emphasized to us by many of our friends, there is no one language called Konkani. As you go through the coast, the Konkani language is actually many different languages. So today's modern technology actually is the first time since the emergence of radio, first abused by Mussolini on a large scale, to now go back to a very different world where there is space for heterogeneity. And that is the story of food and YouTube. Okay, think of the richness, the diversity of cuisines and cultures that can be protected, preserved, and extended through the world of YouTube and cooking, where people are able to talk in their own languages with local ingredients about their own food. So I have a little personal story. Uh, in this room, we are a nice Khichdi. You are half Bengali, half Punjabi. I am half Kutchi, half Kathiawadi. For you from a distance, you may think Kutch and Kathiawad are just one administrative boundary of Gujarat, but the Kutchis will proudly say to you that we speak a different language called Kutchi, and many people from Gujarat, which is the name for the coastal strip, would not comprehend an authentically Kathiawadi conversation.
In fact, Kachis invented the underwear, the kacha, which is so impressive to me. But carry on. Sorry.
Okay, so one tiny subset of the Kutchis make a dal dish which is called osaman. Okay, and I have searched the entire internet for the osaman made by my mother, and it isn't there. It isn't there. I consider it one of the world's great dals, and it's missing. And my sister and I plan to do the hard work of making a YouTube video of her making osaman. And Vartika, is that an interesting project for you to capture this legacy while we can? Because there are some physical motions that she does that can't be described, and it's just magical how that thing happens. So there's so much richness and diversity, and only today's technology allows us to preserve some of that heritage and then get back to the recombinant DNA of innovating, experimenting, and doing cool new things in the future. So it is a plea for preservation. At the same time, it's not a conservative's plea for stagnation. It's not a fly in the amber. I don't want to glorify the past. There is knowledge in the past, and then it is up to us to be intelligent and creative and pull an interesting culture around ourselves every day.
I did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with friends I've introduced you to, Sameer Seth and Yash Bhanage,
Yes.
of Bombay Canteen and O Pedro, which I think is the best restaurant in Bombay. And they're embarked upon a similar interesting project of food heritage through memories and stories.
Yes.
And in fact, I think Bombay Canteen a few years ago, when India turned 75, or I forget exactly when, but they carried out this project where they asked people to mail in recipes of their grandmothers, and then that was their menu for a day. And I thought that was so beautiful, a kind of preservation. What you said about languages, I want to elaborate a bit. I had a great episode with Vinay Singhal I've referred to, good guy, great entrepreneur. And Vinay told me the story of how he was born in this village in Haryana. And he shifted to some town, he went to school, and in the 9th standard, I think he joined that school in the 9th standard, and he realized he was screwed because he didn't know English. Right, and he had to learn English from scratch, and he did, and he topped the class, I think, because he's just driven. And that is story one. Story two is when he moved to some other big city, a proper big city, and then he realized that he had to learn Hindi. He was born in a village in Haryana. It was Haryanvi, right?
Yeah.
And today that's and you find that with dialects all over the place.
Yeah.
Maithili, Bhojpuri, everywhere. The giant monster of Hindi just taking over, destroying you. But it's turning around. Like he says that now people who watch stage.in and they watch his Haryanvi stuff, kids come to him with tears in their eyes and they say, for the first time in my life, I don't have to feel ashamed of my language. And I think that's utterly beautiful. But for our next chapter, I want to double click on something you said earlier. You use a beautiful phrase that food cannot be fly in amber. And I want to talk about, what culture is, using that as a reference point. So, I was thinking about what is culture. When I was thinking about this episode, what is culture? Because we think of Indian culture and we have a broadly nebulous idea, but it seems not completely free floating. There is something there that is culture. And in the context of food, in the context of language, what is it? And in the context of food, here's what strikes me, that culture has two elements to it. One, it is contingent on local conditions wherever you are. So depending on what the local produce is around you, what the climate is like, etc., and other circumstances which I'll get into, like class and caste, you come up with a particular kind of cuisine. And then in the second stage, that interacts with the rest of the world, globalized influences come in, and everything is a khichdi. So you start with a local base, and then this khichdi comes in, and that's also contingent. What comes in from where, what influences take over, how does mimetic desire play out in a particular thing being popular. And it's fascinating to see how certain staple items have become popular or have even originated because of this. And I want to give a few examples of that because it's so fascinating. Like, first is the PL 480 wheat program, which was, India was having an agricultural crisis in the 60s until the Green Revolution, before the Green Revolution happened. And the US came out with something called PL 480, where they, shipped wheat in large quantities to India. And until that time, South India wasn't really into rotis and chapatis and all. And it became a little bit like that, thankfully not too much like that, a little bit like that around that time. Now, Krish Ashok, in his recent episode with me, tells me this fascinating story of how his theory, and this is of course multifactorial, but his theory for why more women work in South India and more girls go to school, or at least this was true at a particular point in time. I don't know what the figure is now. And one of the factors in this is that women in North India are expected to make rotis, and rotis is labor intensive. You kind of got to do it all day, takes a lot of time. Whereas in the South, they were more into rice. You make a batch of rice and it's going to, run for that day or the next day or whatever. So it's much easier. Women have more time to go out and do things. And obviously, it's multifactorial, household tech and blah, 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 the way economics works, many other factors in this. So he talks about a time where I forget exactly what was it, the Japanese invasion of Burma, but basically rice was in short supply and the South had to be fed. So probably during the Second World War, therefore the orders from above to the South were eat more wheat. And there were wheat promotion campaigns carried out. And hey, the women were working, the girls were going to school. They didn't want to sit around all day making rotis. So they came up with a compromise, which was a kind of wheat that can be cooked like rice, semolina. And that is the origin of semolina upma, and this is sort of such a fantastic story that you have circumstance lead to a food which then becomes a part of your tradition and a part of your culture. And I love that. That's remarkable. In a similar way, the galati kebab, the legendary story behind it is that the Nawab or whatever, he had problems with his teeth, he had no teeth or whatever, so they made something that was completely melty, and because of that, we have the joys of the galati kebab. Similarly, you have, Doc told me a story about kappa. Kappa is tapioca, right? Really common in the South, really common in Kerala especially. And you have kappa biryani and all of that. Fantastic item. Originated, in the sense not originated, but became popular there, where in the middle of the 19th century, again, there was a rice production problem, not enough rice to feed the people. And the king of Travancore realized that kappa, or tapioca, cassava, whatever you want to call it, was a cheap source of easy starch for the people. And therefore that becomes popular and that becomes a part of the culture. And you have various other kind of circumstances coming into play. For example, fuel sources. We don't think about this. Why do we cook the way we do? What is the influence that fuel sources play in it? Fried food in India is relatively recent, right? A main food source, and this is again an insight I get from Doc in that tremendous episode that is in the show notes. A main source of fuel was cow dung. Right? And cow dung, and another reason why the cow is venerated so much, which tells you how even so much in religion is circumstantial and contingent. And cow dung gives off a low flame. It's a slow heat. And therefore, a lot of Indian cuisine was predicated around boiling food. It is only when the Mughals came in that you have tandoors and you have frying and you have all of that stuff. So again, just how something as simple as what is your fuel source can shape an entire cuisine. And today we don't even realize it with the things that we eat, but that's been a part of our history. Other incentives come into play. Doc pointed out that at the time we recorded that episode, which was 5 years ago, and I'm presuming he hadn't eaten at the amazing O Pedro ago. He said, "Hey, Bombay restaurants are so bad." And I said, "Okay, why is that?" And his response was great. And his response has something to do with podcasting and why I do what I do. His response was that, look, in Bombay, rents are high. So when you invest so much in opening a restaurant, you cannot experiment with a niche or with something experimental. You have to play to the lowest common denominator. So you will get your Udupi restaurants, you will get your Punjabi, your paneer butter masala restaurant. And I suddenly thought of Pratap Bhanu Mehta because he's called PBM. So paneer butter masala, a person I absolutely adore, as you know. And so a little factor like that makes everybody, and economic incentives makes all the restaurants bad. And of course, we've evolved to a better place since there, because of globalization and all that. The audiences have become more demanding and experimental, and we've gone beyond that. Why it's relevant to podcasting, to take a digression, is that I think of radio as essentially broadcasting to the lowest common denominator, especially in India. Might be different in, there was a vibrant FM culture in NYC, for example. But in India, FM licenses were so expensive that if you got an FM license paying hundreds of crores or whatever, you had no option but to go Bollywood and popular music, and also the government didn't allow political news and all of that. So all you are left with is the lowest common denominator. So if I was to go to an FM station and say, hey, let me do a scene and the unseen, or let me do an everything is everything with my friend Ajay Shah, the card-carrying economist, they would have laughed me out of the room, right? But today I can. Again, that initial drive towards homogeneity, which you pointed out, and then this sort of delightful change. Now, the final sort of interesting food angle I want to talk about, and this is something I discussed with Krish Ashok and Naren Shenoy on my episode with them, and Naren and I have discussed it a year back and said, why don't we do a project and try and figure out more about this, is the influence of caste and class on cuisine. Like Naren's observation was, you go to a village, you might think it is one village, but the food that is being eaten by the Brahmins, for example, will be very different from the food eaten by the Dalits and so on and so forth. And how do those form themselves? Like a lot of great non-veg food is eaten lower down the caste ladder, right? A lot of offal meat, for example, will be eaten lower down the caste order because it is like too impure even for those who have regular non-veg. Otherwise, the spices that they use will be really of a different order. So when you kind of, and this increases the diversity of India in a sense. And there is a tragedy here as well. Like one of my learnings from my episode with Tony Joseph and the book that he wrote, and that's a delightful kitten behind us. I hope they're not fighting, and we'll be fine. And one of my revelations from that episode is that when all the different migrations to India happened, and the Aryan migration was a migration, not an invasion, but when all these different migrations happened, all the people who came partied with each other for a couple of thousand years until about 2000 years ago. And that's when a particular ideological strain in the Gangetic belt won out, and you have caste endogamy, which is why David Reich says that if you want to look for a large population, the Han Chinese are a large population. India is full of many different thousands of small populations. So you have caste endogamy, which affects the lives of women, because if you want to maintain caste endogamy, you have to control female sexuality. So there is a drive to female seclusion and blah, blah, blah. Long story. Discussed that with Alice Evans also in my episode of The Seen and the Unseen with her. But it's interesting how that plays out in food. If the different castes aren't eating with each other, then those different cuisines take particular lines. And perhaps today they are melding a bit, especially in cities.
An analogy with evolutionary theory, island ecosystems are interesting and remarkable. So by dumb luck, a certain set of creatures are on one particular island, and then they are isolated, they're cut off from the mainland, and then over millions of years they evolve in distinctive ways. So perhaps we could think of each little Indian tribe which is policing endogamy as being that little distinctive culture where ideas bubble and evolve and become distinctive in their own way.
And I also have a pet peeve of mine, 1 minute rant, I want to get it over with. These days it's become fashionable to talk of cultural appropriation. I think that term is nonsense. that term is just incoherent. It causes dissonance. If it's cultural, how can there be appropriation? Culture is about the melding of influences, the melding of, there's just so much delight in that melding. And I know you have a story about, because I'm a card carrying half Bengali, a great admirer of Robida. I know you have a story about Robida, about the dangers of, policing culture too much and, trying to keep rigid boundaries along what belongs to someone and what doesn't. So tell us that story.
Our good friend Rajeshwari Shengupto told me about how after the death of the great man Rabindranath Tagore, the inheritors of his legacy and the owners of his intellectual property were extremely picky on policing the use of that IP. So they demanded performing arts that would play precisely in the way that was done in his time. And they wanted it to be a fly in amber. And at a deeper level, that is a shame and a tragedy, because then it does not become the recombinant DNA of engaging with the changing world and being the raw material out of which new ideas come about. It is a certain sad view of the world where something is pristine and pure and you just want to hang on to it for the rest of eternity. And that's a cold and pessimistic view of the possibilities of human culture. Actually, we each of us make culture every day, and a more eclectic approach. Okay, so I'm no friend of rap music, but surely there should be a Robindro rap Shangit.
And no, I'm sure there is. Why are you no fan of rap music? Hip hop is amazing. The sort of things you can do with rhythms and language and all of that. It's just so rich and beautiful. And when I first heard it as a kid in the late 80s or early 90s, I was like, what is this noise? People are talking. Why can't they sing? But I fucking love it. It's such an amazing art form. I'm so surprised. I must introduce you to some of the delights of good hip hop at some point in time. And by the way, if you want to, someone who wasn't wrapped up in cotton wool like Robida was Shakespeare. And everybody's dug into Shakespeare for inspiration and done all kinds of things with him. Pink Floyd has performed his Sonnet 18, or Dave Gilmour has, and there is even a rap video of Akala performing Sonnet 18 at about the 5-minute mark of the video that I'll link from the show notes right now. And that is culture. Culture is party, actually. I'm just thinking aloud. Culture is all of us having a party. Yaar, mix karo, dance karo, enjoy karo. Is it not?
So just to be humanities academic about this, the term culture is used to convey all the learned behaviors of Homo sapiens. Okay, and right here I should say that many non-human creatures also have culture. So there is a famous experiment, there's a famous recording from nature where there was a certain species of monkeys in Japan, and one female was spotted for the first time in their history of taking rice that was mixed up with sand and washing it in sea water so as to isolate the rice and then eating it. And that was a piece of knowledge. It was not in the hardware, it was an idea. And that idea then percolated to others in her band and then gradually went to other bands. And scientists have had the opportunity to document all the steps of this journey. So I don't want to imply that creatures other than Homo sapiens do not have culture, but everything that is the software about Homo sapiens is culture. It is the whole operating system, it is our mores, it is our ways, it is language, it is problem solving, it is science, it is law, it is the everything that we do that makes us human. And so culture is a big tent. It is a whole range of learned behaviors, and all of it can and should be subjected to the scrutiny of the kind that you took to apply to food culture. And in this, of course, the camel in the tent is the ethnocentrism, a technical term for people who look at the world from their own tribe's point of view and look down on everything else. And there is more than a shadow of that widely prevalent in India. And I think a lot of us would do well to think in a more liberal way, in an open-ended way, about the word culture and about the concept that we each of us we get to write the story of our lives. So we inherit some culture, but then we interrogate it. We make a distinction between some deeper values and the text of the operating system, and we keep innovating in it.
You know what? I'm just thinking that I have a beautiful definition of culture, and we should rename our show after that.
Okay, tell me.
Everything is everything.
Yes. We are almost at the end of this. Tell us your recommendations for today.
I want to recommend three books, right? And one of them is Early Indians by Tony Joseph. I've already spoken about that, where he looks at new evidence, genetic evidence, and it's incredible how you can analyze the genes of living people and actually figure out history thousands of years in the past. It's like mind blowing. So you have to read that book. It gives you a sense of what we are, where we came from, and of course we all came from Africa, but the intricate story all the way up to the present day. And it's a really powerful book. And there are two great strands in that book, which two other books also deal with. One is Wanderers, Kings, Merchants by Peggy Mohan, where Peggy looks at linguistic evidence, the evidence of what you can find out from the living languages around us and what that tells us about the past. And it's incredibly fascinating. Like, I read that book, I was just so blown away by it. And the next person who recorded with me after Peggy, when Varun Grover came over once to record an episode with him, and I just had to give him that book. I loved that book so much and was so flabbergasted he had not read it. Because if you love language, if you love our culture, if you love India, that's a beautiful book that you must read. And that also has tremendous insights that pair up with Tony's insights. You have Tony's insights of the migrations happening to India, and many of the people coming are mostly men. They are hordes of men, and then they are hooking up with local women, either with consent or otherwise, forget that, but they're hooking up with local women, and then you have these mixed families that are happening there. Now, there are genetic implications of this, but there are also linguistic implications of this. And the linguistic implications often are that you have a language that is developing through the men and a language that is developing in the women, and you'll have a little boy who will spend the first 2 years of his life, with the women and will speak a particular language, which is a particular kind of local dialect, and then he will join the men and he will speak another kind of language. So it's a sort of an incredible book. And the other strand in Tony's book was about migration, right? And he takes that cosmic view and looks at migration at a much larger scale. And a book that zooms into India and looks at migration on a smaller scale is India Moving by Chinmay Tumbe. And that is a book about the internal migration within India over the last 2000 years. So in a sense, it completes Tony's story. That is zoomed out, this zooms in. And the biggest TIL of that, which just blew my mind when I first realized it, is that the largest source of internal migration in India is marriage. Women get married and leave their homes, right? And when you think about the implications of that, because apart from elite women, everywhere else, when women get married and leave their homes, they're essentially leaving their lives behind. They're leaving their old selves behind, and they're going into another place and almost starting from scratch. Men will often have the same friends that all their lives. With women, it's almost like starting over if you're moving from one village to another village. So, a profound social insight from history. So these are three books that I think go very well together. They're all brilliant books. Chinmay's book, not so much written about, but I think it's one of the great books of the last 10 years. Tony's book, of course, contains fundamental truths, and we must read it for that. And if you love language, because Peggy's book is full of such insights about the origins of Hindustani and Urdu, and why Ghalib sometimes wrote in a way that no one could understand, and there's politics behind that as well, and all of these intricacies playing each other out. It's just a fantastic book. So Ajay, what's your book for today?
Not a book, but I have two recommendations. Okay. I think we should all take more interest in fermentation. So there are great Indian fermentation cultures around the South Indian Italy and the dosa, around dahi and all that. But the weather shapes these opportunities and possibilities. So the perfect temperature for dahi is 36 centigrade, and so on. There are two great pathways to fermentation which actually don't fit well with the natural conditions in India, but these are nevertheless very important ideas, well worth exploring. The first of them is sourdough bread. Okay. we could do multiple hours on this, but right now I just want to give you the headline that it is just superior. It is Pareto superior to eat fermented grain as sourdough rather than eating any industrial bread, having yeast that is purchased from a shop that is used to make bread.
And speaking of circumstances, is it true that sourdough bread, which is now such a hipster favorite, was once poor man's food?
It was how all bread evolved. And then came the industrialization of yeast and the industrialization of bread. In the beginning, all bread was sourdough bread. But its best locale, the best temperature is about 20 centigrade, which does not happen a whole lot in India. So in India, we came to the culture of unfermented breads, the roti and the naan and so on. There's a bit of a khamiri roti world in North India, where I guess it gets to 20 centigrade sometimes. But for the rest, we primarily have an unleavened bread culture in India. And both in terms of taste, but certainly in terms of health, I would just recommend to everybody that, do whole grain sourdough. It is just superior and it'll open up a world to you. It's good to buy this stuff. It's even more fun to make this stuff. You have to fight for the 20 centigrade problem. And that's one great thing to do. The second similar idea is that there is a fermented milk which is called kefir, Kefir. There again, the problem is that the perfect temperature for the fermentation is 20 centigrade. Many times in India, you don't readily get 20 centigrade. It's not the 4C in a fridge. It's 20 centigrade. So it's a bit hard doing this, but there are many good sources of kefir grain in India. I happened to get one batch from Bangalore and it was like perfect high quality stuff. So these are great things worth exploring and you'll have a lot of fun and it's good for your health.
So therefore, we can conclude that may you have peace in your life, but ferment in your food.
Yes.
And with that, thank you for watching. Do like and subscribe. That means the world to us, and we hope you'll come back next week. How will you come back next week? Unless you subscribe, you won't even know an episode is out. You'll miss it. You really want to do that, please subscribe. And thank you for watching.